Today is Human Rights Day around the world, marking the day in 1948 when the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, the human rights in mind, since apartheid, South Africa has been regarded as one of Africa's most stable and open democracies. But this year, the country has been downgraded from narrowed to obstructed in a new report by CIVICUS Monitor, a global research collaboration that rates and tracks fundamental freedoms in 197 countries and territories. According to the report, People Power Under Attack 2021, to tell us a little bit more about South Africa's downgrade and what it means, we're now joined by Mandeep Tiwana, who's the Chief Programs Officer at CIVICUS, which is a global alliance of civil society organizations and activists dedicated to strengthening citizen action and civil society throughout the world. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Mandeep. Welcome to the program.
My pleasure. It's great to be back here.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about CIVICUS Monitor. What does it measure and how do you go about it?
So the CIVICUS Monitor is a global partnership with 20 research organizations around the world, and we measure the core civic freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. These are fundamental human rights that are essential to uphold the scaffolding of democracy. And we do this by looking at multiple sources of information and data, and then we grade countries in 5 different ways, ranging from open to closed.
All right, so with that in mind, what did you find? What's the general picture around the world in terms of civic space?
So the global picture is not very encouraging. In fact, 9 out of 10 people live in countries where the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, which are part of the constitutions of almost every country, essential part of international law, are severely restricted. Now, this is extremely worrying from our perspective, but the more worrying issue for us really is also about attacks on protesters. Now, we know that in the modern era, great changes in our societies have come through the power of peaceful protest, whether it's the decolonization struggles, whether it's the struggle for civil rights, whether it's the anti-apartheid struggle, whether it's the struggle for gender justice, whether it's the struggle for racial justice that is taking place at the moment, or highlighting the climate emergency. All of these have come when people have mobilized in large numbers, demanding equality and agency and the ability to shape their futures. Now, the right to peaceful protest is being attacked by governments around the world in very, very serious ways. And this really is a big challenge for us as a global society.
All right, so I'm going to put up one of your maps, and it shows the levels of space, etc., etc. I'm hoping it's going to come up just now. So when I look at this heat map, unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of orange and red in Africa. What does that tell us? What is that suggesting?
So I would say, yes, we see a lot of orange and red, but that's not just in Africa. It's on other parts of the world too. But yes, there are certain concerns about countries in Africa where we've found that this democracy is yet to take root. And one of the big challenges that we found in our recent report with regards to
the next
events.
Carry on, sorry.
One of the challenges that we've seen with regards to events in the continent is detention and attacks on journalists. And the other big challenge we've seen is that coups have taken place in recent times. And this has really set back the quest for democracy on the continent.
All right, let's talk about our continent then. What are the typical violations that you've been seeing top the list in Africa?
So attacks on protesters, like I mentioned, remain a serious issue. In fact, in North Africa, this remains a serious challenge, but also in other parts of the continent, there have been many, many challenges with people coming out onto the streets and, they're being attacked, they're being prevented from protesting, but journalists are being attacked, civil society activists oftentimes, end up being stigmatized. So whenever people expose corruption, whenever organizations and activists try to uncover rights violations, we find that they face very serious persecution, and that remains a matter of concern.
And I suppose it's saddening often how we see the authorities being the main perpetrators of some of these abuses.
Absolutely. In fact, it's the state duty to protect fundamental human rights. That is why we set up rule of law apparatuses. So those who should be protecting citizens and enabling the free exercise of their right to exercise democratic dissent, of their right to shape the public discourse, are the ones who oftentimes end up being the ones who actually end up denying them that right. The authorities should be the enablers of justice, but oftentimes they end up being the perpetrators of injustice.
I looked at your report and I was surprised to see, and maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about this, that women tend to be disproportionately violated much more than men, even in these kinds of spaces.
So yes, women activists end up being attacked a lot more because there is patriarchy that exists in our societies. When women exercise their rights online, they're subject to all sorts of gender-based violence. When they exercise their rights offline, they too are subjected to gender-based violence. And this is a serious problem within our societies, where women human rights defenders are challenging deeply entrenched patriarchy that exists. So certainly women's organizations, women human rights defenders are under the firing line, and this is something that we really need to do something about together. But it's also not just women human rights defenders, but it's also LGBTQI rights defenders. Sexual minorities are coming under serious attack, and defenders of sexual and minority rights are also coming under attack, and including and especially on the continent.
All right, COVID-19, we saw in some countries where it seems as if authorities were using COVID-19 as a cover for abuses. Is that something that you observed?
So COVID-19 has really accelerated the fault lines in our societies. Where there was inequality, it increased inequality. Where there was oppression, it increased oppression. And in many parts of the world, our research has found that authorities used COVID-19 to enhance censorship, to enhance illicit surveillance, and to increase the coercive powers of law enforcement agencies. This has had a very negative effect on fundamental freedoms.
All right, so let's bring it to South Africa. Our viewers here, very interested to know. Let's start with what it means to be downgraded from narrowed to obstructed. What does that mean?
So it's not an easy decision for us as CIVICUS, because South Africa really, as you mentioned earlier, is a hopeful democracy. South Africa is a celebrated democracy around the world. And this has serious ramifications across the world because people look to South Africa, South Africa's constitution, South Africa's history against oppression and injustice. So the downgrade of South Africa is concerning. In fact, there's three areas which precipitated the downgrade for us. One is the excessive use of force by law enforcement agencies when policing protests. Now, that remains a serious matter of concern. Of course, we understand that at times protests may turn violent, yet the response of the police needs to be proportionate, it needs to be lawful, and it needs to be in line with international and constitutional standards. The second big issue for us in South Africa has been the assassinations and attacks on activists and on whistleblowers. This constitutes an inability of the state to protect those who are seeking better governance in our society. So that remains another challenge for us. The third is the insecurity felt by defenders of LGBTQI plus communities' rights. So activists that are working to protect and promote the rights of sexual minorities are feeling that they are operating in extremely insecure environments. So this has led to the downgrade of South Africa on the CIVICUS Monitor.
And I suppose you were concerned about the unrest that we saw in July.
Certainly. And the unrest, of course, has many factors in it. including inequality, including breakdown of rule of law, including challenging of constitutional and judicial norms by certain politicians. So all of that certainly is a major cause of concern. But South Africa has a scaffolding of democracy. It has the mechanisms in place. It has a constitution in place. So these things can be addressed if there is sincerity of political will to do that.
All right. So, some people might say, but hang on, the police do as much as they can, but sometimes they really are tested by citizens and civilians. What do they do in those circumstances?
Well, police are trained in accordance with the law. They are the enforcers of law. So they definitely need to act in lawful ways. They cannot take the law into their own hands, and they cannot exceed the remit of their powers. The police are given powers by our societies, and the police cannot use those powers that society gives them to abuse the rights of societies. So there are many, many different ways in ensuring upholding of law and order. So there needs to be some investments in policing, but also investments in police accountability. Oftentimes when police exceed the remit of their powers, it's because they feel there's an atmosphere of impunity and they can exceed their powers and get away with causing this loss of life to citizens.
What would you like to see happening?
We'd like to see a conversation happening in the country on what kind of constitutional culture, what kind of mechanisms are needed to enhance respect for rule of law, to enhance respect for civic freedoms, to enhance respect for democratic institutions and democratic values and democratic principles. And if this happens, we will see that there's more accountability, there's a culture of adherence to rule of law, and we can see improvements in the state of civic freedoms in South Africa.
All right, Mandeep, we're going to have to leave it there. I wish we could talk for a little bit longer, but I suspect this is a conversation we probably should be having more frequently, even in between your annual census. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Indeed, every day should be Human Rights Day.
Absolutely.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's Mandeep Tiwana, who's with CIVICUS, talking to us about their report. And we've seen South Africa's civic space shrinking a little bit from narrowed to obstructed. So it should be a cause for concern for us to watch that. We're certainly not as bad as a lot of countries around the world. Our continent not filling itself with glory, sadly, but we have an opportunity, I guess, to improve. All right.